Hello, everyone. My name is Gil Penalosa, and this is Cities for Everyone, the webinar, where every other Tuesday we have fascinating guests to come and share their knowledge, their experience on how to create cities that are more sustainable, equitable, playful, where everyone can live healthier and happier. Today, we have a fascinating guest, Richard Louv. Richard, who I've known for years, we're good friends, wrote the book Last Child in the Woods. And with this, he launched a world movement on children and nature, on the nature deficit disorder. He has written many other books, he has spoken all over the world, and he's here to share what are the trends, what is the new nature movement. Richard, thank you very much. Welcome.
Well, first, Gil, you know how much I respect your work. There's few people in the world that are both humanizing and naturalizing cities as you are. And if I had lived in Toronto, I would have voted for you when you ran for mayor.
Thank you.
And there's always Parliament, but I'm not a Canadian, so I won't be able to vote for you then.
Okay. No, but it's really important for people that are on the call is to getting involved. I think politics is important because a lot of the things that we talk about are not technical, are not even financial. A lot of this is about policy, about politics. So one of the things I told Richard, I said, I hope that I do this because I'm hoping that people will get inspired to be a passionate advocate on whatever people want. It can be on trees or on parks or on children and nature or on anything, but it's not a time to be silent. So Richard, how did it start? How did you get involved? How did the Last Challenge on the Woods come about? And how do you see the impact that it has had?
Well, Last Child in the Woods, the book happened because I actually was a kid once. And I spent much of my boyhood in the woods at the edge of Kansas City where I live. And my parents often did not know where I was, but my dog always knew where I was. And when I was up to no good, my dog would go home and get my mother. So I had a very free-range childhood. I had a really intense relationship with those woods, with the creek that ran through it. And as a journalist over the years, I included this issue of nature in cities and our connection to nature and how it was changing in several books. But by the end of the 80s, I just couldn't stand the idea that generations would grow up and not have the privilege that I had. Even in cities, the densest urban neighborhoods, they also have nature if kids are aware of it, if schools make an effort to get kids outside and parents. When I wrote Last Child, I looked for research on two things. One was the disconnect between children and nature, which I believed was happening. The second thing I looked for was research on health and cognitive functioning and other benefits of nature. That's the more important set of studies, is the benefits of nature to us. To my astonishment, I can only find about 60 studies in the world that looked at those two things. This was in 2005 when Last Child was first published. I had a couple of very good academics who were helping me look for the research. And I wondered, why is that? Why could something so large have been ignored so long by the academic community, except for a few pioneers? There are several answers for that. One of them is, where does the research money come from? What pill can you sell, for what nature gives us? So that is part of the reason that the research has been so thin. But also it's because we've devalued nature over the decades. Education has devalued nature, except in the lab, except in turning nature studies essentially into math. And this fear had grown among parents, deep fear, not only in the United States, but around the world, of stranger danger. And my profession of journalism was partly responsible for that. All you had to do is watch cable news and you'd see the crimes against children outside the home, and they seemed to be skyrocketing. Truth was, for about 40 years, violent crime toward children outside the home was going down. What was going up is violence toward children in the home. And the neglect of children, both by parents and relatives, but also the neglect of nature, the neglect of connecting our kids to nature, something that my generation took for granted, was disappearing. There are other reasons, many things that you've written about, Gil, or spoken about. The rise of traffic, the disappearance of places to walk. I mean, parents would be told, get your kids outside and go for a walk. Walk where? In San Diego, where I moved from recently, if you took a walk, pretty soon you'd hit a freeway ramp. So it became almost impossible to take walks in many neighborhoods. In fact, in some of the newest neighborhoods, it became harder than it was in the older urban neighborhoods. Today, one of the signs of progress is that the number of studies has skyrocketed. It's gone from about 60 to at least 1,400 studies of either the disconnect from nature or, more importantly, the benefits of nature. The Children in Nature Network is a nonprofit that was formed, grew out of Last Child in the Woods. And the idea was to support a movement that in a way was already there, but has grown exponentially since 2005 around the world. And if you go to that website, which is childreninnature.org, we created a database of studies, of research on this issue. And you can see abstracts of all of these studies, and it's free to anybody in the world, and it's highly used. People use it to gather evidence to go to their school board or their mayor or other officials to try to get them to change policies. Other evidence of progress is the enormous increase in the number of nature-based schools. It's mainly preschools at this point in the United States. That's not saying a whole lot because there were only a handful 15 years ago in the United States, but now there are hundreds. In Europe, they started much earlier, and there are quite a few there, and it's increasing there as well. We see family nature clubs. These are clubs of parents that band together. And if somebody wants to go for a hike on Saturday, they put out the word, and anybody want to go with us? And 10, 20, 30 families will show up. In San Diego, the Family Nature Club that started several years ago now has, I believe, about 3,000 families as members of it. There are hundreds of these family nature clubs around the world and in Canada. And I'm hoping they're starting up in other countries too. Pediatricians have begun to pay real attention to this. In 2010, I was asked to give the keynote to the American Academy of Pediatrics, their national meeting of pediatricians and pediatric nurse practitioners and others. There were about 5,000 of them there. And I was astonished to be asked to talk about nature deficit disorder. That's the phrase, that's the central idea of Last Child in the Woods. It's not meant to be a medical diagnosis. It is a way to talk about this thing that in decades prior, we had felt was happening, but didn't have a language to talk about it with. And now that language exists, and the conversation is going on. So pediatricians are starting to, or started some years ago, to begin to prescribe nature, literally to write prescriptions to go outside. There's a fellow named Dr. Robert Zarr in Washington who was in that audience, went back to DC, Washington, DC, organized other pediatricians, and they began to write those prescriptions. They also created a database of all the open space in Washington, DC, all of the parks, et cetera. So they could not only prescribe and hand the prescription to the parents, but could turn to the computer and say, you've got a park a block and a half away from your house, and this is what you can do there. We've seen a lot of other progress we can get into later. Cities are starting to pay attention to this, and possibly, Gil, that has a lot to do with your work. The Children of Nature Network is now a partner with the National League of Cities. In the United States, the National League of Cities represents something like 18,000 mayors and other urban leaders. And it's working in at least a dozen cities now as target cities. And the idea is threefold. One is to try to understand what it means to be a nature-rich city. What does that mean? What does that look like? How many pediatricians prescribe nature? How many trails have been added this year? And on and on. The second point of that effort is to begin to research that over time and to show how it works, to show that it improves health pretty dramatically. It improves cognitive functioning to have a nature-rich city. It reduces violence in some neighborhoods, and on, and all the other benefits that nature brings us. And the third objective is to begin to train mayors in the future to make sure they make their cities nature-rich as much as they can. So I will stop there, and hopefully we can have a conversation.
No, it's great. And people, if you have any questions, please put them on the questions. You recently wrote an excellent document on trends. What would you say are two or three trends that you see coming up? And then we'll go right after that. I'll start with some of the questions William Dowie and Lisa Donahue and others are sending. So what are some of the main trends that you see through the future, like even post-pandemic, that it had an impact on people?
The pandemic is one of those, or the outcomes of that pandemic are one of those trends. During the pandemic, when people were in seclusion, they actually looked out the window and they began to see that there was nature around them, even in the densest urban cities. And when they realized, and I heard from many parents about this and other people, they realized watching that fox cross the backyard, or even watching a bird or an owl that would return to a tree outside their window, they realized they did not feel so alone during the pandemic. That was an important lesson. I mean, the loneliness epidemic, as you know, Gil, began decades ago and has only increased. Medical folks are very concerned about that. Turns out that human isolation is associated with many of the same diseases as smoking and obesity. So it's an incredibly important issue. And it turns out we're not alone, which is something I wrote about a lot in Our Wild Calling, the last book. We're surrounded by a great conversation among animals. We now know that mycelium connects forests, and there's a conversation going on in the plants around us. And we can be a part of that conversation if we pay attention, if we notice. So that's one of the trends. There are many others. I'll just list a few of them. One is the growth of eco-anxiety and environmental depression, the mental health issues that we can do a lot about just with access to nature, increasing that access not only in parks, but in our backyards and our rooftops, et cetera. Continued growth of research, as I mentioned, the retrenchment in response to COVID. And that means that many of the benefits we saw from COVID, like outdoor classrooms and so forth, we are not sure that they're going to continue. So we have to make sure that we keep the pressure up there. A new focus on direct nature connection. What I mean by that is, scenery is only summary. It's the cliff notes. And this is something I've been working on recently. How do we notice nature? How do we pay attention? Can that be taught? Should that be part of education? There are 3 areas of research that I think are extraordinarily important that have increased, I think, more than many of the others. And really only in the last 15 years or so. One of those areas is the human senses. We don't have 5 senses. We have conservatively 9 or 10 senses, as the scientists who study the human senses say. The second area of research is on that great conversation around us that I mentioned. Every month, new research comes out on the sophistication of communication outside among animals, among plant life, et cetera. Just yesterday, there was a report about elephants, that elephants actually refer to each other by name. We had known that something like that was going on in some species, but they actually say these names. That sounds outlandish, but that's new research. And the third area of research is on consciousness. The people who study consciousness now say, many of them, that our consciousness, but the consciousness of other living creatures too, does not stop at the skin. It's not contained in our brain. It extends out into the world. One scientist did a study with spiders, a particular kind of spider, and he says that the web of a spider is not just to catch flies. It's part of its consciousness. It extends outward. And to the extent that ours extends outward and connects with other consciousnesses, this is a different way of perceiving our relationship with nature. So how do we do that? How do we develop skills to look deeply into nature, not just as scenery? That's one of them, and I'll stop there. And there are about 20 others that Cheryl Charles, who now works with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, helped write this report, and it's free to download on the Children of Nature Network.
Yeah, people, that's a really, really good website, Children and Nature Network, and they do an amazing work. And Richard, William Dowey, now that you're talking about how to educate, he's asking if the people in high school, K-12 and others, if they should have a reset of formal eco-literacy. Nature is complex, like he says, we don't know what we don't know. So should we have to change the structure of the courses and how to have people become more aware of eco-literacy?
I don't know enough than I should about other countries and what's happening in education there. I know a little bit, but not as much as I would want to. But in the United States, he's right. I would make the case that we basically killed the love of nature in high school, many high schools in the United States. There was a study a few years ago of indigenous kids I think it was either in Wyoming or Montana, and they found that the indigenous kids knew a lot about nature and would talk about it, would express what they knew in class up until around 8th grade. And then they just stopped talking. And part of the reason is because around 8th grade, we turn biology just into math. Math is important, chemistry is important, but when we turn the magic of nature into numbers, we reduce it. It's a reductionist way of viewing the world. So I think we need to expand biology, not reduce the amount of chemistry, but expand biology, which means eco-literacy, but also means having new ways to teach kids about nature. The best way I can explain this, and it would have to do with what I called noticing before. I was at a nature center a few years ago in the upper Midwest, and I was talking to a young woman who was a nature educator there, and she had a khaki uniform on, and she said that the place on the nature center on its grounds that was most popular, that all the kids and all the parents immediately went to, and not only preschool kids, but grade school and high school kids, they were all drawn to the pond, where the frogs would, of course, all jump in the water at the same time as they approached. And I said, do you use that pond as a learning experience for these kids and their parents and others? And she says, oh, yes, we do. We go down and we test the pH of the water. And I said, no, I mean, do you ever really use that? No, we do science experiments. And I asked her that question several times and asked her finally, do you ever take the kids down and just sit next to the pond and wait for the frogs to come up and imagine what it must be like to be a frog to the best of your ability, these kids? And that didn't compute. A guy standing next to us later said that she's a great teacher, but she's under so much pressure from state standards, district school standards, et cetera, to essentially turn nature into numbers. And when it comes to eco-literacy, environmentalism has a tendency to turn nature into numbers too. The number of inches the ocean is rising, and so forth. We can't skip the step in which in which all of us allow nature to touch our souls, allow nature to express its spirit to us, and for us to feel a part of that spirit and to imagine what it must be like to be a frog. You cannot skip that step and expect children to grow up learning to love nature.
Yeah, that is so important. And I think that many well-intentioned people in cities that are eco-friendly, they want to keep people away from the rivers, people away from the trails, away from the ravines. Oh, we don't want too many people. No, the cities are a tiny part of the world. So, and people are also animals. And we should allow people, because if we promote that people walk on the trails, on the ravines, on the parks, they're gonna fall in love with nature. And if they fall in love with nature, they're gonna be the biggest advocates of nature. And let me combine. Elena Kayak is saying, what do you think of 4-day school week if the 5th day people are gonna be outside? Well, I'll combine that with Lisa Donahue's. Actually, the 4-day week, I'm really concerned, because when they are thinking of making school shorter, it's taking away classes that some people think are not important, such as recess, having less recess, less play, less nature, less arts and crafts and things, because they think, oh no, in 4 days we can do math and science and history. No, I think we need more. And Lisa Donahue is asking about the potential of nature-based schools and programs in raising a generation of children who will shift the tide towards climate change. And actually, in 4 weeks from now, we're going to have as guest someone that Adam Bidenstock, who builds, he created a foundation. He does only playgrounds 100% of wood. And he created a foundation to give out classrooms to schools. And he has given out a wood classroom, so the chairs, the tables, everything. And he has done it to over 4,500 schools. And one of the things is that it doesn't have to be 100% nature. Yeah, there are some amazing daycare and amazing kindergartens and some elementary schools that is 100% outdoors, but others could be 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day, half a day. What are your thoughts on these nature-based schools? Because I think they have some amazing potential.
Well, first, I think it's a great idea to have 1 day a week outside. particularly if it's immersed in the act of really deeply noticing nature. But many schools are outside completely, particularly in preschools. There are forest schools in Europe that have been around for quite a while. It turns out the studies show that when most kids learn in nature about anything, not just about nature or science, but about anything, in a natural environment, the cognitive abilities are improved, that kids learn better in those kind of environments. As I said, the number of nature-based schools has increased incredibly. Adam Bienstock, who you mentioned, is a great advocate of natural playgrounds. Natural schoolyards are spreading all over the United States and around the world. In many countries, that's not new, but that is one of the trends that is growing quickly. And one of the trends I want to mention is that, and this isn't on our list, this isn't on the report that we did about trends. It's something that I've been thinking about quite recently. When you look at the number of homeless people increasing, ironically in San Diego, the police used to call the homeless people outdoorsmen. That increase is going on, and that demands a solution. That demands housing for these people. The problem is, are we entering a period in which the issue of housing for the homeless competes with open space, natural space in cities? Washington State just came out with a report that or guidelines for cities, and actually nature was de-emphasized from in the past because there's such a need for denser housing to house the homeless and other people who can't afford it. My own son can't afford to live in San Diego, so he's now a digital nomad. He finds it cheaper to move around the world working from his computer than he does renting an apartment here. We're hoping he comes home. That competition between the need for housing and the need for outdoor space in cities, I don't have a solution for. I'd be curious, Gil, what you have to say about that.
And Richard, also merging two questions. Kathleen is saying that in Kingston, Ontario, but we have people from all over the world, from Malaysia, from Kenya, from Chile. But so these questions that I pose always are applicable to anywhere. She's saying that the city is cutting down a lot of trees, a lot of forests. So how to deal with the mayor and city councilors and city staff to convince them? And that is aligned with a question from Joanne, who says that she finds interesting that you use the term nature rich. So if it's nature rich, how do you explain the social value of investing in nature and the return on investment so that the immediate and future benefits of children is clear when making up the decisions of of land use? So how to make decision makers understand nature rich?
One of the reasons why it's important to have a movement, not just a top-down movement, but a bottom-up movement, to reconnect not only children, but all of us to the natural world. And it's one of the reasons I call it the new nature movement. Sometimes it's the children in nature movement, but more often I talk about the new nature movement because it includes adults as well. Is because we have to have a constituency for those ideas. We have to have voters. We have to have people who put pressure or praise the principals who either do or do not change their schools to have more nature, or the mayors, etc. So that's one reason it's so difficult, is because the constituency needs to be built for that. The economic argument is there. There's a new report that Children Nature Network sponsored about the economic benefits of connecting kids to nature, of more trees in cities and so forth. and it's on the website and can be read there. But there are a lot of research. There's a lot of research that talks about the dollar, the dollar value on trees in terms of health, and that's even before we get to climate change. The importance of trees in cities and shade. Increasingly, cities are very hot. We're going to need a lot more trees for that. But often in cities, the people who are in charge of keeping the trees alive in a city, or are in charge of sidewalks or other urban spaces, see trees as a nuisance. You got to keep watering them. You have to keep them alive. And that has to change, that attitude. The argument is there. And I'd urge all of you to go to the Children Nature Network, to that website. These arguments are also in my books, but it's free on the Children Nature Network.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why also, like, there were 3 organizations around parks that they were dying, and about 10 years ago or more, we did a study and merged them into one, and I was elected twice as chair of the board of World Urban Parks, because we need to be generous with the information. We need to share, and that's why I also like so much Children and Nature Network, because of that possibility. Also, if people had access to nature, one of the things that we noticed, like during the pandemic, people say, hey, go outside, go to the parks and be physically distanced. Well, in almost all of the wealthy areas of cities around the world, everybody had nature close to home. But in many of the low-income areas, there was a huge lack of green spaces, lack of trees, lack of green spaces. And it's incredible that is such a lack of equity of nature, when this should be an equalizer. Everybody should be having. Also, and Richard, what are your thoughts on things like Shirin-yoku, when the Japanese talk about forest bathing, and it's something really simple. It's people going into nature, but you don't have to go to the middle of nowhere. It's within the city. You go into a park and no telephone, no friends, just by yourself. Yeah, and having your senses really feel nature, feeling the wind, listening to the birds, touching the trees, and 10 minutes is good. I mean, 30 minutes is even better. But even just 10, 15 minutes of having contact, it's so good for mental and emotional health. How do you see this trend that people are starting to see nature and appreciate it more? In a sense that also there seems to be overwhelming emphasis that it's for mild cases of depression and anxiety is good. Like it is free. It doesn't have to have a huge effort. But like you were saying, look at the frog coming out, or look at take a look at the bee going into the flower, or something like that. What are your thoughts on this Shirin-yoku and this trend for people to actually look like in the spring when we see? I'm always amazed since I moved to Canada that you see in cities some weeks is minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 20 Fahrenheit. Everything seems to be dead. And spring comes around, and little by little, every day you see one leaf and another and another. What are your thoughts on this Shirin-yoku and general trends of people being more conscious and being more meaningful about their experience with nature?
Well, first, on your first point about equity, about the unfair distribution of parks and open space in cities, the wealthy get them, and the other people do not have nearly the amount of access. I've actually argued for over a decade that this should be considered a human right, connection to nature. And in fact, in 2012, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, which is the biggest network of conservation nonprofits and others in the world. About 10,000 of these organizations are networked. The IUCN passed a resolution saying, yes, this should be considered a human right. They said for children, I think it actually ought to be for their parents too. And until it's seen as that important, as a right, it'll be treated as a nice to have instead of a have to have. In terms of forest bathing, as you were talking about, it's known by many names, or several names, but it began mainly in Japan. And it was when the Japanese parks officials noticed that when they got people out in nature that they did better, they became healthier, et cetera. And they began to set up sessions where people would just go out and absorb nature. That's grown in sophistication. There's now an international organization that accredits nature therapists to take people out into the woods for forest therapy or other natural areas. I actually went on a forest therapy, a forest bathing thing last year. Went up the mountain. I can see a big mountain called Vulcan Mountain from our front window. And I went up the mountain with this nature therapist and a group of about 5 women. It was an extraordinary experience. I tend to be skeptical about a lot of things that sound magical, but there was something magical about this. When the therapist would send us out to go pick a tree and sit under it, and then come back and tell us what you felt and what it did for you. Exercises like that. And often when people came back and sat in the circle to report, I noticed that they were telling their stories about the tree and themselves, often in the form of what I considered fairy tales. And I wondered, where did fairy tales come from? There's more in nature than we see. And as a species, we tend to anthropomorphize nature. And what is in nature that we don't see, for instance, that conversation that we're learning more about, all of the amazing amount of communication among trees and animals, et cetera, in nature. We turn that into things we can understand, like little people, elves, fairy rings. And I wonder if that's where fairy tales came from, that we have an instinctive understanding there's something more in the forest than what even science has told us. The irony now is that science is now making that case. When you look at that research that I mentioned earlier about the amount of complex conversation in natural areas, I think that's what we're sensing, but we don't have words for, and we turn it into elves and fairy rings. And that's fine, but that may be where fairy tales come from. That kind of sensitivity to nature is encouraged, I think, by forest therapy, by these kind of sessions. And it does. Apparently there are chemicals emitted from some trees that actually aid people with stress and even mental illness. That's been shown in the research as well. So it's not only perceptual, it's also chemical.
And Richard, that what you're saying is very much in link with a question from Catherine Burke. Catherine is asking, how do we help teachers to develop the deep ecological understanding that will help them see that the value of sitting by the pond and make those choices to develop transformative ecological education? How to make the case so that the boards of education will actually make it, or have you seen, or can you share experiences where actually boards of education have made nature part of the curriculum?
When I first started out giving my sermonettes about this issue 19 years ago now, because of Last Child, and then each successive book, I noticed that there would usually be two or three teachers who would come up to me afterwards and say, I'm getting my students outside and I don't care what the principal says. Often it was not the environmental education teacher. It was the language teacher that would take kids outside to write poetry under the trees, or the art teacher who would take them outside to do art, or the biology teacher who actually wanted to make use of that stream at the end of the schoolyards. I began to think about them. I call them the natural teachers, who just instinctively know how important being outside is for learning. One of their characteristics I noticed was they all felt alone. Often they were the only teacher in their school who had that kind of awareness or were doing something about it. And I wondered, what if they didn't feel alone? I think these teachers need to be networked. The Children Nature Network started something called the Natural Teachers Network. And at one point, there were teachers from 48 countries who were trading notes online. And they did not feel so alone when they learned that other teachers felt the same way and were doing similar things. The IUCN, as I mentioned, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, is working on a program to be launched, and I'm an advisor on it, along with Cheryl Charles, to encourage nature-based education around the world. We're not sure what form that encouragement will take, but that's a hopeful sign. The other thing is to remember that we're now not only in this third or fourth generation of parents, but also of teachers who have had less and less experience in nature when they were growing up. So even when they know about the benefits, they look at the studies and they want to do that in their classroom, they don't know how. And they never pitched a tent. They never, turned over rocks to look for bugs when they were kids. So they're at a loss when they make this decision. Also, they're up against a lot of lawyers. The litigiousness of society, certainly in the United States, but also, as I learned in Australia, it's beginning there. The teachers feel so constricted, not only by standards, but by the threat of lawsuit, of taking kids outdoors. One of the things that everybody agrees that needs to happen is that education schools that teach teachers to be teachers need to begin to incorporate this in the education of future teachers. Because somewhere that learning has to take place if it didn't when they were young kids.
Yeah, that is so important. Something that impacted me once that I heard you was how the millennials, and people criticize millennials, but it's almost the last generation that actually grew up playing in the street, playing in nature, playing with insects and with the flowers and the trees. But many of the following two generations have been indoors. So many of today's teachers, they need when they are in capacity building of the PA day and they're gonna be retrained, it should not only be just on how to teach geography or how to teach math, but it's taking the teachers on walks in the woods so that they realize how important nature is. Because like you said, some of them themselves have never been on a tent, have never been overnight in nature, don't take hikes. So it might be better for teachers on one of those training days is just take them on a hike, enjoy nature until so that they will fall in love or will understand why it is so critical for them to teach, and also why it's so critical. I love the connection of grandparents and grandchildren, which we see more often in the parks because we're living much longer. So we see 2 and 3 and 4 generations at the same time in the park. So that some of this knowledge gets connected. And Richard, Adriana is asking about your thoughts on how to consider with the heat conditions, like at the extreme temperatures. Do you think that part of it is because of lack of concern for nature, but do you see this as a thing that people maybe are realizing that nature is more important than what they thought before. And like Sean was asking also about the wildfires, if people are gonna get used to wildfires or if people actually are gonna do something about it. We have time only for one or two questions. So if people you wanna have your last questions, please write it. But what are your thoughts on this from Adriana and from Sean and the impact of nature and extreme temperatures?
That's one of the most important reasons to have trees on schoolyards, but also in our neighborhoods. Many cities have increased the number of trees. I think New York City has increased the number of trees. But one of the problems is sustaining that, is keeping those trees alive and planting more of them. And yes, it's extremely important for health and for many reasons, but one of those is the protection from the sun. So that's extraordinarily important. In any case, there's so many things we need to do because of climate change, and the awareness of climate change has to increase. And you mentioned fires. I live in a place now that is always threatened by wildfires up in the mountains near San Diego. We're very aware of it. One of the things that happened when we moved up here, by the way, was that, when Thoreau moved to the pond, at Walden Pond, I think part of him thought that he was going to escape industrialization. There is no escape now. We moved up to these mountains and I'm more aware of the damage to nature because of climate change than I was in the city, because oaks are dying all around me. These oaks are like elephant graveyards, the dead trees around this area. So more connection to nature, I think, makes us more aware of that. And that tends to probably feed the despair that people feel. We've got to figure out a way to deal with that despair. And what I've talked about in the past is the need for hope, but not just any hope, the need for imaginative hope. Ways to create images in our head, which you do, Gil, with every one of your presentations, of what a nature-rich city could look like, what the future could look like. I found over time, about a decade ago, when I started asking audiences, what are the images that come up into your mind when you think about the far future? Almost always those images were described as looking a lot like Blade Runner and Mad Max, maybe the Hunger Games. At least there's a few trees in the Hunger Games. In other words, a post-apocalyptic view of the future, a post-nature view of the future. What happens to a culture when it cannot no longer conjure up images of a beautiful, a good future, a nature-rich future? Beginning in the earliest grades, we need to begin to do that. Only if we do that can we create those places, can we change our cities, change our schools. And that takes imagination, that takes imaginative hope.
Yeah, I love how the emphasis on planting trees. We need to plant trees, but more than plant trees, we need trees to grow, to live. Many trees are planted the wrong variety in the wrong place and maintained the wrong way, and they die within the first year. So one of the things that I recommend cities is whenever you outsource the planting of trees, outsource not only purchase the tree, but the maintenance for the first 4 years. So the people that are planting the tree are making sure that it's the best tree planted in the best place with the best soil, because if the tree dies, they have to repair it. They have to replace it. So it's once also because a lot of the environmental benefits of a tree come after 15 or 20 years of life. So when people say, oh, 20 years is a long time, yeah. So the best time to plant those trees was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. Richard, I want to invite everybody that in 2 weeks from now, I'm gonna be both host and presenter about Copenhagen. So people, tell your friends or whatever. But before we leave, Richard, the last question for every guest is, what is your call to action? What do you think people could do on the nature movement? You have here people from all around the world, from different ages and backgrounds. what do you think people could do as part of the nature movement? This is not just an isolated and a tree hugger, but it's much more than that. It's the business person, the public health, the ecologist. What would be your call to action to the people that are here? Very happy listening to your presentation. And I want to thank you very, very much for having accepted the invitation, as well as to the hundreds of people on the line. So, Richard, your call to action to all of us.
First, I want to mention something about teachers. There was a study done in your city, Gil, where you were in for mayor, that showed that teachers who took the kids outdoors, the students, they did not burn out at as fast a rate as the teachers who were stuck in the cubicles with the kids. So this is good for adults too. It's good for teachers also. I think the important thing is to know other people who also believe this, and to network with them, and to create groups, and to join organizations like the Children in Nature Network, so that you feel you're not alone. That's probably the most important thing. And secondly, what I mentioned before, to begin to think imaginatively about the future and be drawn to the people like you, Gil, who have painted a picture of a future we'd want to go to, a nature-rich future.
Yeah, and I think the people need to understand that we are going to live better and happier and healthier, because sometimes people think that if we live more sustainable, it's going to be a worse life. What are we going to sacrifice? No, we got nothing to sacrifice. Like when we said that we have double and triple the size of the houses in the last 40 years, I mean, if we lived in 1/3 of the house, it's not going to be the end of the world. But if we live more nature rich, if we have nature everywhere, in the home, in the sidewalk, in the school, in the place of work, we're going to live better. It's not about wars, it's not about sacrifices. But I love also your emphasis on sharing, learning. Go to Children and Nature Network, go to other websites, the 880cities.org and others, because we need to learn from each other what works in order to adapt and improve, and what doesn't work in order to avoid. Richard, thank you very, very much for all you do, all your books, and your initiative creating Children and Nature Network, and for having accepted the invitation. It has been a wonderful conversation, and I wish everybody a wonderful day. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Gil. Thanks for what you do.
Richard, thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate you having accepted and having done these wonderful conversations. This is the first time that we didn't have a PowerPoint, and nevertheless, everybody stayed. People were very engaged, lots and lots of questions. I posed almost all of them, you answered them, you opened our minds on how each one of us can contribute in some way to create a better world, to help in the connectivity between children and nature, actually between people of all ages and nature, about the new nature movement. So I hope that everybody has enjoyed it, and please, this recording, share it with decision makers, share it with elected officials, with senior staff, with advocates, with media people, with anybody that you think will make good use of it. And I'll see everyone 2 weeks from today, every other Tuesday, on Cities for Everyone, the webinar.